Oral History with Dr. Lee Newman. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
Happy to be here.
This is for the Carnegie Library Oral History Program and the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum. And I'm interviewing Dr. Newman in the National Jewish Hospital where he works. And my name is Dorothy Charlo. Just take it from there. Could you first of all give me when and where you were born?
Sure. I was born in 1953 in New York City.
And how did you get to Colorado?
The long way around. I ultimately came here because I was seeking the best training in pulmonary medicine, and the best training program for making a good lung doctor is here in Colorado at the university.
So you came here for your training and then?
And then I stuck. Right.
And could you describe a little bit what, what your specialty is? It's in lung disease?
Sure, yeah, I'm a specialist in pulmonary medicine, which means that I trained did 3 years of training in lung disease here at the University of Colorado, part of that time here at National Jewish, and before that had done work in internal medicine.
And you do teaching then also?
Yes, I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine and in the Department of Preventive Medicine over at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, and I'm a professor here at National Jewish Medical and Research Center.
And you do research, I presume?
Yes, I do. I teach, I do research, I take care of patients.
Well, as you know, that what this is about is we're doing a whole lot of oral histories of people who've had some involvement with Rocky Flats, and we've interviewed a lot of workers and we'll be interviewing more. And just trying to get the whole picture of what the Rocky Flats nuclear plant, what the whole complex history is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And one piece of that seems to be this disease called berylliosis.
Right.
Could you just talk a little bit about how you learned about that and how you fitted
Sure.
in with Rocky Flats?
Sure, no, I'll be glad to. In 1984, I saw my first patient with beryllium disease, chronic beryllium disease or berylliosis. It's all the same thing. And that was in fact a retired nuclear physicist who had worked with Fermi during the Manhattan Project, and he was a patient at National Jewish, and I was in training at the time. One of the doctors working here said, "Lee, you seem to be interested in occupational diseases. Why don't you come by and see this gentleman?" So that was actually the first person I ever saw with beryllium disease. He was not a Rocky Flats worker.
Was that, was his name Carlson?
No.
Okay.
And not too long after that, that was in my clinical year. I was trying to decide what kind of research I was going to do. And I had a growing interest in occupational health, in particular occupational lung disease, and also an interest in the immune system and how our immune system attempts to repel or deal with foreign invaders. When we inhale things into our lungs, it requires the immune system to respond to the insult. So I was trying to identify work I could do in immunology research and combine it with my interest in occupational medicine. In fact, what I did was I went into the library here at National Jewish and came out about a month later with the idea in my head that I would develop an animal model for studying how a particular kind of lung disease develops. It's called granulomatous lung disease. And I decided that I would use beryllium and try to put it into mice as a way of developing an experimental understanding about how people develop immune system overreactions. Around that same time, while I was developing in the lab the techniques for putting beryllium onto immune system cells and putting it into mice, one of my mentors at that time, Kathleen Kreiss, Kreiss, who ran a small occupational medicine group here, Dr. Kreiss said that she had gotten a call from the medical director at Rocky Flats, and so we followed it up with a conversation with him. His name was Lloyd Wright. Now, Dr. Wright wrote us a letter, in fact, asking us a very specific question. He said he had a woman who had been working in Plutonium area, had become pregnant, and so they had to pull her out of the radiation area, and he wanted to know from the academic community whether we thought it would be safe for her to go to work in beryllium. At which point Kay and I looked at each other and said, beryllium? Gee, we didn't know they used beryllium at Rocky Flats, and Lloyd Wright laughed at our obvious lack of information about what they do out there, and he said, well, I think about 60% of the U.S. supply of beryllium is being used right now at Rocky Flats. So that was kind of a little bit of that was one piece of the story. So we were aware that there was beryllium out there. Now, around the same time, a patient came into National Jewish who had been diagnosed some years earlier as having a disease called sarcoidosis, pulmonary fibrosis. There was some, I think, fair to say, some argument in the medical community as to what they thought he really had. He came to see me at the clinic at National Jewish and gave me the medical history of having been, and he still was at that time, a worker out at Rocky Flats who was, in fact, a beryllium machinist. Conveniently, around that same time, I had developed the ability in our research laboratory to test the blood cells for their reaction to beryllium. So I invited him to give me a sample of his blood. As he tells the story, I saw him this week in clinic. He said, yeah, you took 22 tubes of my blood, Dr. Newman. Well, I don't know if it was 22, but we took a lot of blood, and I was able to demonstrate that his blood cells, if they were fed beryllium, would proliferate. They would overreact to the beryllium. What at the time we called a beryllium lymphocyte transformation test, what we call today a beryllium lymphocyte proliferation test. Because this category of white blood cells called lymphocytes, they're the cells that are out there looking for foreign invaders. If you put beryllium on them, if they've seen beryllium before in your body, they will react by proliferating. They will divide and divide and divide. They'll fill up the petri dish with cells just like them, a clone of cells that are there to react to beryllium, which in fact is the same thing that happens in a beryllium disease patient's lung. So his cells reacted. This alerted us to the fact that he probably had beryllium disease. I did a special test called a lavage of his lungs to confirm that his lung cells reacted to beryllium. And with that, was able to confirm the person who we would call the index case, the first documented case of beryllium disease at Rocky Flats.
And this would have been?
It's around 1985, somewhere in that vicinity. I'm not real good on dates, so that's sort of a ballpark. We didn't stop there. At that point, we said, well, this is potentially important. In the field of preventive medicine, in the field of occupational health, if you see one person with a disease and you know that they've had exposure in the workplace, the probability is that other people have been likewise exposed and that there will be other cases of disease. So we followed back up with Dr. Wright out at Rocky Flats, and shortly thereafter, a little later after that, Dr. Joe Furman became medical director, but then it was still Lloyd Wright. And we said, we've got this fledgling blood test, which in fact had been discovered around 1970, but was sitting on a dusty shelf in the medical literature. It wasn't really being used. But I had dusted off the test. I had improved the assay in the lab. And we said, that if you've got one case out there may be others of people who are sensitized or allergic to beryllium. We'd like to use this test out there at Rocky Flats. Dr. Wright's comment was, boy, that sounds really interesting. We'd love to have you come out and use that test here in the workplace for your research study. But I suspect that you won't get the Steelworkers Union to agree to it. And they were always at that point in time in a lot of tension, contract negotiations, and clearly we were potentially stepping in the middle of something that was already contentious. So what we decided to do was to go ahead and ask that question. So we went to the Steelworkers local. I think it might have been Jim Kelly who was the president at the time. So we sat down with Jim and his core committee of some of his health and safety people. We contacted a guy named Mike Wright, who was with the Steelworkers International. They brought out some medical advisors to the union, and they all reviewed what we were doing. They said, we want you to do this, but we kind of doubt that you're going to get management and medical to agree. So there was sort of the fateful day where we agreed for everyone to sit down together over on Indiana Avenue at the Steelworkers Union Hall, and got the medical director to come down. So Lloyd Wright came down, the steelworkers were there, we sat down together and discussed what Kay and I were proposing would be this pilot investigation. Originally, we wanted to look at people who were retirees, because we thought, well, there'd be a better chance of detecting disease in people who were further out in time from when they were first exposed, because we assumed that disease would take a long time to develop. They were all pretty insistent that what they really wanted us to do was to look at the current machine shop workers. There were about 50 or 55 workers. So we said, okay, well, maybe we won't get much in the way of results.
Do you know why? Just because they
wanted
to focus on current workers?
Yeah, I think that probably there were a number of reasons. One of them is that those are the workers who were there right then. They had greater immediate concern for them, there having been somebody with disease already found. So we agreed to do that. And we wrote up a proposal that was reviewed by all the parties. Interestingly, around that time, there was a review of all this as well by the Department of Energy. And the feedback that we got was the Department of Energy and the beryllium industry, which was really one company, Brush-Wellman, that they weren't very enthusiastic about us doing this and were in fact discouraging Rockwell International, who at the time was operating the plant for the DOE. They were in fact discouraging Rockwell International from letting us conduct the study. Interestingly, after that whole series of discussions, there was a head of health and safety. I think his name was Campbell. I think it was maybe George Campbell, who basically said to me and to Kay, look, I don't really care what DOE says. This is a decision that Rockwell can make. This is the right thing to do, and we want you to do it. And in fact, Rockwell International directly funded the pilot study that we did. So we went in on a pretty tight little budget. We tested 50 or so workers. The results have been published in the medical literature because they were so shocking. What they showed us was that about 10% of the current machine shop workers were not only sensitized to beryllium, they already had the allergy, but in fact when they came down here to National Jewish and I did the bronchoscopy procedure to look inside their lungs, I found that most of them already had beryllium disease. That, you might say, was the watershed for the next steps in beryllium disease detection at Rocky Flats.
Were you surprised?
I was surprised by the number of people affected. I expected that just looking at a group of 50 people who were current workers, I thought the odds were pretty small that we would have found anything, and that if we found anything, we might find maybe a person who was sensitized, maybe one. The other thing that I think I was surprised by, we did not expect that we would have a tool here that would tell us who already had disease. We thought that this blood test would just tell us who was sensitized, and then we would have to come back and follow up with those people, decades down the road to figure out who got disease. So the other big surprise was not only were we picking up who had the allergy, but in fact it was telling us that those people were already at stages of illness. Some of them very mild, some of them more severe, and that was a big surprise. So that was my entree into events out there at Rocky Flats. I have to say that as professor types, as academics, Kay and I were pretty naive. We had worked with industry before. Certainly Kay, who's very experienced in occupational medicine, had worked with industry before. But I think that we had a huge learning curve there in terms of appreciating the scope of beryllium work, both at Rocky Flats and elsewhere.
I presume that you couldn't have known much about what they did with beryllium because everything was so secret, especially at that time.
Sure,
Was that a factor?
It was to some extent, but we found ways to work with that. So, for example, I've never held a Q clearance, so I couldn't ask certain questions. So, imagine being a doctor, taking a medical history, looking for occupational disease, and bumping up against questions where, rightfully so, the patient would say to me, I really can't talk about that, doc. And one of the things that I had to learn were what were the questions that I could ask and that they could answer that were within bounds, and what was out of bounds.
Yeah.
So it was
Can you give an example of that?
well, it would be okay for them to tell me that they were machining parts that went into triggers for nuclear weapons. What they wouldn't tell me was the shape. Okay, and I said, well, I don't really care what the shape is. I really was, after other kinds of information. So that would be one example. Another example is they would tell me that they were working with beryllium, but they wouldn't necessarily tell me what form, whether it was pure beryllium or an alloy, but it was okay to tell me that they were working with beryllium. So those were the kinds of things we'd bump up against. They could tell me what buildings they worked in. They could tell me what other kinds of operations were going on around them, but not the details of what they did. So I would learn that they were milling, grinding, polishing, casting, breaking casts out of molds. The tasks that a worker would do became very clear to me through the course of taking hundreds of these medical histories. So like yourself, I'm a form of historian. And you piece together, without having been there to see it, what was going on.
So you say you saw hundreds. This was over the course of...
Right, so I should probably just pick it up where I left off.
Yeah.
So we had done the pilot study. We considered this a pilot, and it was a stunning, rather shocking result. It probably led a lot of people to ask a few questions about, well, who are these people in Denver, and who is Lee Newman, who is Kreiss, and what are they doing? So I think it raised a lot of questions there. Our best thing to do was exactly what we did, which was to write up the results and get them published in the medical literature. So we did that, so the word was out. And then what we did was, again, with very, very solid support from the steel workers as well as from management and medical, was we were able to go ahead and apply for independent funding from the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, which Kay and I did then. After having those pilot results, we said we need to do a larger population-based epidemiologic study of a larger portion of the Rocky Flats plant. So we went after funding and got funded from the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the NIH to do a much larger scale study. We studied almost 900 workers over the next several years, results that got published around 1993. So in the late 80s, we did a study of about 900 workers, and it confirmed very much the results that we had found with some other startling findings. The first thing it confirmed was that if you were a beryllium machinist, there was nearly a 10% chance that, if you were ever a beryllium machinist, there was nearly a 10% chance that you were at least sensitized to beryllium, and a pretty high percentage of them already with beryllium disease. The second thing that was a little bit of a surprise was that we also found sensitization and disease. You doing okay there? We found sensitization and disease among people who you wouldn't have called beryllium workers, among security guards, secretaries, front office workers, managerial types, people who you'd say they may have had bystander exposure, but they weren't in the thick of it, they weren't the day-to-day operators.
And is that because it floats, or?
Well, it's because they're going through areas and getting exposed, and as we understand today, there is an element of genetic susceptibility. Some of us are more susceptible to the effects of beryllium than others, and so at lower levels of exposure, some people go ahead and develop the disease, whereas there are some other people who have, it seems like they bathed in the stuff and have never developed the disease and never will. So there's a part about the host, as we would say in medicine, the host versus the environment response. So if you are genetically susceptible and you get around beryllium, that's a bad combination, and that puts you at a higher risk.
And even just walking through an area that was close to where, such as a secretary might have done.
Right. Well, an example of a secretary to one of the managers who worked in the 44 building, who was in charge of the beryllium operation for a period of time. There was a little bit of traffic that went in and out of the beryllium shop into the administrative areas, and there wasn't always probably consistent changing of their clothes in and out of the blue smocks, and there were activities that would have led to low-level contamination, maybe some of it through the ventilation system, I don't even know. But there was opportunity for low-level exposure, something which now is in fact understood to occur across most of the beryllium-using industry. And in fact, there have now been multiple studies done that have confirmed what Dr. Kreiss and I discovered back in those late 80s studies.
But your study, your pilot study, as you called it, was the first then to show this kind of.
That's right, and for the it really was kind of a revolutionary thing in terms of the Department of Energy. You know, here now was documentation that there was a disease. In fact, it then became the most common occupational disease of people who were Cold War veterans. And at the time they weren't veterans, they were in the Cold War. So this caught a lot of attention. It led to some very annoying things happening, like finding myself quoted in big headlines about deadly diseases, things that people in the media tend to do without much sensitivity to my patients and how it affects them. It made us very busy in trying to take care of these patients and realizing that there was a lot we didn't know and a lot more research we needed to do in order to do a satisfactory job of taking care of these patients. But on the Department of Energy side and on the industry side, this was now a demonstration of a couple of things. First of all, if it was a problem at Rocky Flats, why wasn't it a problem at other sites? Second of all, there was now a blood test available by virtue of these studies that could be used to pick up the disease at its earliest stages, and that could be used in a broad screening sense to pick up disease that otherwise was being mislabeled by doctors in the community or not being diagnosed at all. So this was really leading to a stage of now needing to take the research into application and start using this blood test as a tool for what we call medical surveillance, going to the people who work with the metal, testing their blood periodically to figure out who else would be sensitized or diseased. And that's what happened. By 1993, Rocky Flats had institutionalized a medical surveillance program using the blood BLPT. They tested thousands of current workers. They later started testing thousands of former workers. And I don't know at the last count what it is, but the interesting thing is that the data that Dr. Kreiss and I published from the work we did in the 80s has held up. Essentially, if you look across the board at machinists who ever worked with beryllium out at Rocky Flats, I think probably in the final analysis, probably about 5% or more have sensitization and or beryllium disease. And again, a couple of percent of everybody else in the plant, roughly a little under 2% of everyone else in the plant has beryllium sensitization, and many of those also with disease. So next step beyond that was that pilot studies like this started being done at other sites around the nuclear weapons complex. And by the late 90s, we knew that there were cases of beryllium disease at other places, including Los Alamos, later at Pantex, many cases in Oak Ridge at the Y-12 facility. And the word by the late 90s was pretty well out that if there was beryllium being used somewhere and it was being disturbed in a way that could produce dust, that there was a significant risk for beryllium disease.
Did they start giving workers protection early on, or were you involved in that at all?
Indirectly, I was involved. A couple of things to say. One is that shortly after the discovery of the first cases of beryllium disease in the machine shop, one of the first things that they did was they put everyone into respiratory protection. It was not a shop that was previously all that well controlled in terms of exposure. And there's a classic photograph which is circulated many places and probably is in your library by now. If not, you should have it, showing a group of the workers at Christmas time in the beryllium shop. In the background is the Christmas tree. You can see guys with full beards who could never possibly fit a respirator, in a way that could protect them onto their face. People hanging respirators around their neck, just street clothes underneath blues. blue smocks. I've used the picture to teach classes in occupational health. I ask people to pick out the 20 things that are wrong with this picture, not the least of which are the Christmas presents lined up in the shop, the hero sandwich that they've, just everything about it was not very well controlled back then in the 70s. By the time we discovered the first cases in the machine shop, they clamped down. They put in place a lot of controls. They really started handling beryllium in a much more careful way. Interestingly, it's not that the levels before that were all that high, which is another part of the story. They weren't all that high. And in fact, people were being fairly careful as a general rule with how they handled beryllium. But this led people to realize that they had to step it up to a much higher level. And they put everyone in respiratory protection. They started giving them hazard pay for working in the beryllium areas. And that was kind of the next set of steps. They started restricting people from having entry into that shop. They started mapping where else around the plant site beryllium had been used. And even as recently as the last year, they're still figuring out places on the plant site where beryllium was used where there was no institutional memory of it having gotten there. So.
And then I would imagine during the cleanup, this might have been a real problem.
Well, it has been a problem, and in fact, we've done a study which is out being reviewed by a medical journal right now because we wanted to know whether people in the process of cleaning up Rocky Flats were also at risk. And what we found was that the people who have gone in to do the decon work and the decommissioning work and tear the buildings down, they're going in the full Tyvek suits, the full face respirators. They're actually doing well in terms of not becoming sensitized to beryllium. But there was sort of a group of people who went in before the tear down started who had to figure out what the jobs were going to be, and they were kicking around the plant probably with less protection. And we have had some people who have been hired, since production ended, who have been hired for the purpose of cleanup and who have developed beryllium sensitization just from low-level walking around areas in preparation for the official decontamination.
Can you talk about what's the difference between sensitization and getting the disease? Does the sensitization always lead to eventually getting the disease?
Okay, so let me start with the definitions. Beryllium sensitization means that the person in their blood has shown that they are allergic to beryllium. Their lymphocytes react to beryllium, and people who are not sensitized, you can put beryllium on their cells and nothing happens. Another way of looking for that, by the way, is you can think of it as the equivalent of a skin test. If you were to put a little bit of beryllium on someone's skin and put a patch over it for a few days, you took the patch off, you'd find a big red welt. If somebody was sensitized to beryllium, back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, that was one of the ways that we knew that this was an allergic reaction, because people would get a skin reaction if they put that test on them. This is the blood version of that test. So sensitization by itself is not beryllium disease. To have beryllium disease, you have to show that someone's lung cells, that in the lung there is a damage going on, that you have cells coming from the blood, these same lymphocytes coming from the blood, going into the lung, finding beryllium, and then proliferating and forming balls of cells to try to engulf the beryllium particles in the lung. It's like a war that's being conducted with the lung as the battleground. There's the beryllium, the immune system comes in and attacks. Unfortunately, it trashes the battlefield. And so the lung becomes injured. People are unable to get a deep breath anymore. They're coughing, they're short of breath, they're fatigued. And it's because you've interfered with the job that the lungs have to do to take oxygen from the air we're breathing and deliver it to the bloodstream. And then doctors can measure that with x-rays, CAT scans, and breathing tests and measurements of oxygen. So the disease itself means that you've actually shown someone to have the immune system scars in the lungs from the beryllium exposure. People who are only sensitized do not have that lung reaction yet. Now you asked, does sensitization lead to beryllium disease? That's the sequence of events. People who are sensitized go on and get disease. At this point in our research, we're finding that not everyone who's sensitized gets the disease, but the majority of people do.
Uh-huh.
And so when I see someone now who's beryllium sensitized from Rocky Flats, and I still see them, I tell them we're going to put you through some tests to figure out if you're at a stage of having the lung disease already or not. If you don't have the lung disease yet, because you're sensitized, you're at risk for developing it sometime in the future. And so we have to see them back periodically, usually about every 1 to 2 years, and we repeat the test to figure out if they've gone on to develop disease yet or not. And I hold out hope for them because I have some patients from out of Rocky Flats even who we're now going on 15 years of being sensitized without disease. But there aren't many of them. Most of them have gone on to develop disease. Fortunately, for some of them, the disease stays very mild. For some of them, it's much more progressive, and they end up having to get treated.
And what would you say is the difference? Again, a genetic kind of thing, or
Our
exposure, or?
Yeah, I'm afraid that there isn't a simple answer to that. And we've done a lot of research on that, and we still are. At this stage of the game, my working hypothesis is that there are other genes that are involved in the risk of developing more severe forms of chronic beryllium disease. But ultimately it has to interact with the exposure as well. There may be features of the exposure, the dose, how rapidly, how many times, who knows, cumulative dose. There are certain things that we're still sorting out that probably all factor into whether you get severe disease or mild disease.
Now, I gather that the disease, as it runs its course, can cause death.
Every time I've answered that question, I end up with a headline this big talking about deadly diseases.
This isn't going to go in the paper.
That's fine, but let me tell anyone who in the centuries to come bothers to listen to this, that yes, it can be deadly, and I have lost patients to beryllium disease. The old literature says that about 28 to 32% of patients with beryllium disease die of the disease. That was from people who had exposures back in the 1940s and 50s at levels that, as best I can tell, far exceeded the kinds of exposure levels at Rocky Flats. But that being said, if somebody waits too long to get into the doctor, then they can end up with disease that is much harder to treat. We can't slow it down. In its advanced stages, we can't reverse it, and they go on and they die of the disease. Probably today we're seeing fewer deaths because we're diagnosing it earlier, and so we're on top of it. And in fact, many people, we catch them so early that we don't even have to treat them yet. We just say, okay, you got it. We wish you didn't have it, but you're still at an early stage, and we'll just watch it. And if it gets worse, at that point, we'll treat you, and that'll slow it down. So that's the approach now. My heart sinks when someone walks into my clinic who hasn't had the benefit of early diagnosis, because I know walking in that it's going to be much harder for us to slow it down and harder for us to reverse any of the damage. And that's why I'm probably on my soapbox a lot talking about the need for early diagnosis. I've seen too many people die.
Do you think, in your experience with the workers at Rocky Flats, do you think most of them have been eager to come in and get tested, or has there been some resistance? Can you say anything about that?
Oh, I certainly can. The workers from Rocky Flats have been they've been one of the highlights of my personal life and career, because these are people who, just to see the spirit in them, these are people who, faced with an illness themselves, turn right around to me and say, how can I help? And we've had, for nearly 20 years, an incredible outpouring of volunteerism and support from the workers out there. The typical thing that they say to me is, look, if I can do something to help the next guy, I want to do that. Tell me what I can do to help the research. And I would have to say that, just as a rough estimate, I would say probably 90% of anyone who was diagnosed with beryllium disease or beryllium sensitivity out of Rocky Flats has at some point in time participated in a research study in the last 18 or so years, because of that spirit of, boy, this is really a crappy thing that's happened to me, but maybe I can do something for other people down the road. And it's had an effect. And there's a lot more I can tell somebody today when they walk into my clinic that I didn't know 18 years ago. Nobody knew 18 years ago. And that's because people participated in the research, and they still do. Sure, there are always a few people who say, oh, God, I really don't want to do that. But, and that's their right. You know. But most of them, I have some patients who have come in to have invasive procedures done, bronchoscopies done 5, 6, 7 times over the course of a decade, just because they want to participate in the research. So it's been an amazing lesson for me in the kind of unselfish behavior that people can display in the face of personal adversity.
Yeah. Do you know why? Do you think it's anything about the sort of a teamwork kind of thing in terms of their work at Rocky Flats, or do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know. There certainly was a lot of camaraderie. And over time, I think also a little bit of more than a little bit, in many cases, a sense of them versus us, feeling like, not only do I have this illness, but, they could have done more, whoever they is. They could have done more to protect me from getting this. I happen to agree with that. I think that this is a preventable disease. And I think sometimes that spirits people to say, well, one way that I can fight back is by being part of the answer.
Yeah.
And so there was the spirit of that.
Spirit included a fair degree of anger, understandable anger.
Oh yeah, no, there's no doubt. There's been a great deal of anger among my patients, the workers at Rocky Flats, over what's happened to them. Compounded by the rather shabby way in which the workers' compensation system in the state has dealt with them.
Can you speak a little bit about that? I know 1 or 2 people have tried to explain why they didn't get workers' comp, and I can't understand it.
Well, it's because it makes no sense. So I'll try to explain. You have to understand the basic principle of workers' compensation. Since the early 1900s, the deal has been that if I'm injured on the job, I can't sue my boss. But in return, my boss promises to take care of me in terms of taking care of my medical bills related to that illness or that injury, and to provide me with the fair replacement wage if I lost an earning capacity. That's the basic deal. I think we all realize that contract between workers and their employers is a rather tattered and torn contract today. So imagine this situation. You have people who, through a Department of Energy supported program, get screened for beryllium disease, are diagnosed at the major medical center that knows about beryllium disease as having the disease, and then that report of their illness, their work-related illness, goes into the workers' comp system, at which point the insurance company that was insuring, whether it was Dow Chemical or Rockwell International or EG&G or Kaiser Hill or anyone in between, that insurance company the first thing they do is they deny the claim. They say, well, it's just a knee-jerk reaction. Any occupational illness, we have a policy to deny the claim, and then it's back on the back of the worker to file an appeal. So people would go ahead and they'd get a lawyer and have to file the appeal, and then it's lawyer to lawyer in front of a judge and back and forth, and hired gun medical experts to say that Dr. Newman is wrong and the other doctors at National Jewish are wrong about the diagnosis or the severity, and they end up duking it out. I'm going into court next month over people from Rocky Flats who were diagnosed close to a decade ago, and they're still arguing in the state of Colorado over compensation for people who clearly have the disease. You can understand the anger. What happens is it becomes a lawyer's game. The insurance company has no interest in parting with the premiums that it received from the Rocky Flats employer, and so they would rather put it in the pocket of the lawyer. So you have guys who, where if you added it all up, tens of thousands of dollars have been spent fighting their claim for compensation. Probably more spent on that than if they had just paid them off and just given them some money for their lost wages and covered their medical. So a very sad story. Really a screw job. And I think in some ways that that really compounded the anger. I think if early on there had been more of an openness, which came later, an openness about this problem and an acknowledgement that it's wrong that you got this disease and we want to make it up to you. If that had happened early, I don't think we'd have as many people as angry and disappointed today as we have. The other thing that made it rough, I think, and has made it rough for these workers is that, they're patriots and they see themselves as patriots. They were doing something for a war effort in this country, and that's very much the way they see themselves. And so there's not only the anger, but a sense of betrayal. It's very much what I read in my patients.
That we did our job, and why can't they take care of us
Right.
when they screwed up?
That's right. And so it wasn't until, in fact, the late 90s, in part through this failure of the workers' comp system to take care of these people, that certain other things started happening, like the Department of Energy and acknowledging that, yes, this is a problem, and yes, we will set up some standards, and we'll set up a beryllium rule that will apply to all workers exposed to beryllium throughout the Department of Energy complex, and we'll set up a system for people getting taken care of. We'll try to help them get taken care of in the workers' comp system. And then it was some years later that it finally got around to Congress instituting an Energy Employees Compensation Act, which in large measure was implemented because of the beryllium problem. That was, in fact, the driving disease issue that led Congress to act.
In that, in any way?
Oh, sure.
I would imagine that.
Yeah, I was contacted by several different Congress people who were all, it was a bipartisan effort, who were all interested in coming up with this legislation. I spent a fair amount of time, including testimony on the Hill. I couldn't attend, so it was in fact one of the congressmen who put my testimony into the record. I was too busy seeing patients. But I worked a fair amount, as much as I could, with people at the Department of Energy to serve as a kind of a background guy who could give them the medical facts, the research facts that they needed to be able to develop their program. I consider my role to have been a small one, but my role is as an academic, as somebody who has the research information and the patient care information. My job was to translate that to the policymakers. So that's what I did.
Were you satisfied with, or are you satisfied with the results of that legislation in terms of what it's doing for workers?
I think it may be a little too soon to say. There are parts of it that I think work very well. There are parts of it which I'm a little bit less satisfied at this point, but it's a program that's not been around that long, and I think it's still going through some iterative process. So it's too soon to say. For some people, all some of my patients really wanted was for someone to say, "We did this to you and we're sorry," and that would have been enough. For others, giving them lifetime medical benefits and $150,000 isn't enough to compensate for their pain and suffering, as far as I'm concerned. But for others, that probably was the fair and just thing to do, and long overdue. So I don't want to sound like I'm damning the program, because I actually think it was the right thing to do. Whether it ends up being in the long term a well-managed program, a program that really meets the needs of these patients, these workers, time's going to tell.
Do you think that there are any issues with respect to people who have maybe a combination of illnesses from Rocky Flats, or maybe that's not in your area?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. We do have some people who have more than one disease. So people who might have had an injury as well as beryllium disease. Their injury won't get them compensated under that program, but the illness will. Interestingly, through the political process, certain diseases that probably should have been included aren't, and others that, in my opinion, probably shouldn't be on the list are. So, for example,
that's what I was getting at.
If somebody's got asbestosis from working at Rocky Flats, and we do have some people with asbestosis from there, if they only had asbestosis, they don't get compensated under the federal legislation. It's not on the list. But if they have beryllium disease and asbestosis, they'll get compensated because of their beryllium disease. There's another disorder, which if we have a few minutes I'll tell you about, related to inhaling plutonium.
Yes.
And where it stands today is, my guess is that the legislation is not broadly written enough to compensate people who have lung fibrosis from plutonium exposure. It's not on the list. So, there are going to be some gaps and probably some disappointment.
And do you see that those people also in your practice, people who have ingested or inhaled plutonium?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Some of them. What was a common practice if you were a plutonium worker, and you were too hot, they had to move you out. And where did they move you? They moved you over to the beryllium side. They moved you to the cold side. And so a lot of my patients carry partial body burdens or lung burdens of plutonium and americium, as well as their beryllium. A common quote in my clinic, "Doc, if I had known about the hazards of beryllium, I would have stuck with plutonium." Very common statement, because they felt like they at least knew they were being monitored. They knew that plutonium was bad news, but they were working with it. They then go over to beryllium, and they were pretty generally poorly informed about the hazards of beryllium. So, pretty common story.
And in your experience, is that kind of, because they weren't protected for nearly as well for beryllium, that's a kind of understandable feeling on their part. There was better protection for plutonium.
Oh, sure. They were doing that in glove boxes, and yeah, there have been accidents. But by and large, there was a lot more attention to how you handled, hot materials at the plant than to the cold side of things. So on the cold side, you'd have things like vanadium and beryllium and various other metals, some of which I'm not allowed to have been told, and tried not to hear. And different kind of attitude of handling the material. Although still, you're talking about highly skilled workers. I mean, these are people who have a lot of talent and do high quality precision work. So it's not like you're talking about a place with very sloppy practices in general. Even on the beryllium side, we talk about it being too much beryllium. But part of that problem was because even what OSHA would say was safe wasn't a safe level either. So they were working with some guidelines that were misguided. So, but one of the interesting experiences I had in my clinic was when a patient was sent in to me with an abnormal chest X-ray. He was a retired. Excuse me. Right, my next meeting. He was a retired worker who had been in plutonium as well as in beryllium operations, and he was being sent to me because his X-ray was abnormal, but he wasn't showing up sensitized to beryllium. And I took a copious occupational history. What did you do, et cetera, and took him through a complete medical workup all the way to a lung biopsy, and ended up showing a lot of lung scarring, but not beryllium disease. And so I met with him and I said, "Well, sir, you don't have beryllium disease, and I'm not entirely sure what this is because I haven't seen anything quite like this." And he said, "Well, Doc, could it have something to do with that plutonium accident I was in?" And the first thing I did was sort of, mentally slap my head like, what did I miss? And he proceeded to tell me about the explosion, about how he was there, doing an operation involving plutonium where it went critical and the glove box blew apart, and he lost part of a finger, and he inhaled plutonium, and ended up being taken to the medical department and kept there for a number of days because they were collecting everything that came out of his body to establish how much exposure he had had. Well, it wasn't until 30 years later, nearly 30 years later, that he was coming into my clinic with lung scarring. And I said to him, "Well, I suppose that's possible, but I don't know." So what I did was I started digging through a lot of unpublished records, looking at animal studies that had been done up at the Hanford site, and there had been a lot of animal studies looking at the effects of plutonium inhalation on animals. And darned if the animals that survived the cancers, by the end of their life, didn't develop something that looked a heck of a lot like my patient's disease. He had a fibrotic lung disease, and that's what they were seeing in the animals, in the dog models, going out 10, 12 years after inhaling plutonium dioxide. So I said, well, that's kind of interesting. So I went back to the medical department at Rocky Flats and contacted Dr. Furman and said, Joe, humor me. I think that plutonium might be causing lung fibrosis. And so Bob Bistline, who at the time was heading up their radiation recall program, wasn't yet with DOE. Bob Bistline and Joe Furman and I met out at the medical department there, and I said, just pull some x-rays. And let's just look at the x-rays compared to some standard films. And let's just look at, among your people who have the largest lung burdens of plutonium, let's just look at those x-rays against normal. And we start putting up x-rays, and you go, well, this one's abnormal. Well, this one's abnormal. This one's abnormal. I don't know, it was 20 or 30% of the x-rays we put up there just to the simple, quick view were abnormal x-rays. Well, at that point I said, well, I think there's another study that needs to be done. So once again, I applied to the federal government. I applied to this time to NIOSH, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, part of the CDC, for funding to do a study to look at the risk for plutonium fibrosis in people who had plutonium exposure. And we ended up pulling x-rays on, I won't have the exact numbers in my head, but hundreds of x-rays, getting the radiation records for those people, and then correlating them, asking, as you increase someone's dose of exposure to plutonium, was there an increase of the risk of having abnormal x-rays that go along with lung fibrosis? And after you subtract out whether they smoked and other factors like that, was that still a significant contributor? And the answer is yes. There is a disease called plutonium lung fibrosis. The paper is in press now. During the time that I was conducting the research, a Russian group published a paper on the subject in an English-speaking journal from their experience at MIAC, showing that they were getting what they call pneumosclerosis, which we translate as pulmonary fibrosis, among the plutonium-exposed workers there. So now on both sides of the curtain, researchers were coming up with the same finding. So what we've found is that for people who have lung deposition, cumulative lung deposition for 30-year estimate greater than 1,000 rem, there's a very high rate of lung fibrosis. So it's among these retirees. So it's another little story of my involvement out at Rocky Flats.
We have just a few minutes, and you probably have to go.
I do.
Right away. Yeah. And anything else you would want to say, just to conclude this?
Well, at the risk of sounding sappy, I guess the thing I'd want to say is that I've learned a couple of things. One is I've learned a lot about, I think, the resilience of the human spirit, what people can do when they set their minds to it as individuals, even in the face of organizations that tell them don't do it. I think back to the head of health and safety, who was the guy who said, "Oh, heck with the DOE. This study should be done. It's the right thing to do. We're going to do it." Well, if he had said no, where would we be today? We might not be where we are today in understanding this. I think about that first patient that I saw who stuck out his arm for me to draw his blood. If he had said no, well, would we have gotten to the same place? You go back and you replay the events that led to to where we are today, and you realize that at any point in time, usually there were one or two key people who, acting as individuals on their conscience, did the right thing and led us to a better place as a little society, if I think of all of us involved with Rocky Flats as a society. And that's what I teach my children. I teach them that individuals can make a difference, and that's very much, I think, my take-home message from all of this. And that you don't give up when you know that the right thing to do is to prevent disease. if you stay true to that mission, then you can in fact do something that can change people's lives. And it'll change the lives of people who never even heard of Rocky Flats, but because of what the people at Rocky Flats learned through their experience with this disease, it'll end up preventing other people from ever getting this disease, hopefully in other industries. And we're already seeing that impact. And the people out there, they won't know who to thank, but they can come back and thank the people at Rocky Flats.
Okay.
It's nice talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.